But every 500 years, the Latinized culture goes through a huge upheaval, and we're going through one right now. Every time that happens, whatever form of Christianity has to drop back and reconfigure. It doesn't ever cease to be.
They had a deep suspicion of hierarchy and institutionalism.
If fear is the motivation behind not dealing with those sort of in the back of your mind questions, that to me is the worst kind of faith of all. It's despair.
For a decade at the beginning of the 21st century, a group of Christian leaders launched a movement meant to change the church in America.
It's more important for us to feel like we are representing a beautiful expression of our life with God.
It's an invitation into a kind of creativity and a set of conversations and questions.
They were young, in their 20s and 30s, and disillusioned with the way that Christianity was being taught and practiced.
On the website, it said, no need to check your culture at the door. So sport your tats, wear your jeans, carry your Java, and join us at liturgy. And I think I read that 10 times.
Mightier than the thunder.
Christianity was becoming increasingly nonsensical to me when I found out that there was a group of people having the same conversation I was having. I'm like, oh, wow, there's more people.
They planted churches and hosted conferences. They wrote worship songs and they published books. They met in cohorts and bars, and they met online in the blogosphere.
Above all else, they called each other friends.
Because to some degree, the path that we were on required courage. Because if you had integrity, it was going to change the game. Is there any hope for the traditional church?
This was the emerging church movement, and for a time, it was considered by some to be the future of Christianity in America.
And now the first of a special two-part series on a growing movement that's rethinking what Christianity and the church should look like in contemporary culture.
I mean, the friggin' New York Times shows up, and PBS and ABC.
Yeah, I remember all of them. And by others, to be the single greatest threat to the faith.
It's over. He's not orthodox. He's just gone so far that it's barely possible to call him a Christian anymore.
So we'll set aside all of our doctrinal differences to save the planet, let the people go to hell.
Basically, the sentiment of the statement that God's truth evolves. And I see that as a complete undermining of the very nature of what Christianity is and always has been.
And then, almost as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared. Or did it? Maybe instead of going away, it infiltrated all parts of the church in America. I'm Tony Jones.
And I'm Tripp Fuller. And this is Emerged, an oral history of the emerging church movement.
I want to find my way back home.
Over a series of episodes and interactive live streams, we will chart the story of the movement through the voices of its leaders,
including Brian McLaren,
Nadia Boltz-Weber,
Doug Padgett,
and never-before-heard audio from Rachel Held Evans.
So are we done? It's been real.
We'll assess the movement's successes and its failures, and we will consider its legacy.
We invite you to partner with us as we record interviews, unearth long-buried audio, and build a story that we hope you will find compelling, enjoyable, and maybe bring back some good memories.
Click through the link and join us by contributing. When you do, you'll be invited into a private Facebook group.
You'll get sneak peek mini episodes all fall. You'll be invited to join us for live stream previews, and you'll be able to upload your own emerging church memories to the Emerged archive.
Emerged will launch on January 1, 2024.
Emerged is produced by Josh Gilbert and is a homebrewed Christianity production.
So I can begin again.
Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and today the good Dr. Tony Jones is back on the podcast, and we're joined by our friend Josh Gilbert because, we got some exciting news, a little project that's in the works. So how are you two doing?
Great.
Your confidence, Josh, is blowing me away. I just want you to know that was it was impressive. And Tony, how about yourself?
I'm doing awesome. It's great to see you two bros, you two Theo bros. Oh, yeah. Love seeing you, Theo bros.
All day, every day.
Can't wait to see you guys live.
Secret we've had.
Yeah.
In person.
I know. Oh, yeah. When this comes out, we'll be like 2 weeks away from Theology Beer Camp. What? And we'll be having ourselves some fun. And, and people in the house will be getting a taster of your new book, Tony.
Boy, I'll tell you, Tripp, I was sitting on the toilet this morning thinking about my beer camp talk. A lot of good ideas came to me.
What kind of face did I have when I was listening to this imaginary talk you're giving while you're sitting on the throne?
Your mind was blown. No,
okay, that's what I want to hear.
I'm so honored and thrilled that you asked me to give one of the talks. I'm really thrilled to be paired up with our mutual friend Sarah Lane Ritchie, because she's brilliant and funny and insightful, and so I hope that the two of us team up to have a good little session. I think people might dig it. Yeah, I pretty much know what I'm going to do. I've just got to write her on down.
All right. Well, this podcast, normally every so often Tony gets on and we hang out. It's my, the least theological podcast. Tony works hard to talk about normal things, maybe like dad life, might harass me about lifting weights or cutting calories or, things like that. But this time I got a young whippersnapper on here, Josh, because we've lured him in for a little project we're working on. Mm-hmm. Maybe 7 or 8 months ago, Tony and I were talking after people had followed up when we were just telling stories on one of the Tripp and Tony Tell Stories episodes. And I realized that there's thousands of people that listen to the podcast that were just not listeners in the first 7 or 8 years. They had no idea what the emerging church movement was that we were associated with. We started telling stories, and I'm getting emails like, well, what's up with that? Oh, that's where Brian McLaren came from. And, things where I go, wow, well, I guess this is what happens if you do the same podcast for 15 years. And Tony and I were talking about it. I'm like, we should do a Where Are They Now? Or what we learned from the emerging church movement, like a normal homebrewed class. And then we started kind of brainstorming, working on it, and then it kind of just kept growing. It kept growing. And but Tony, tell me? Why don't you tell the story of what happened? Like how we exactly our idea of going, oh, where are they now? What have people learned? People are part of this movement, gone to different places, and the next thing you know, it's turned into a rather large project doing some oral history and such.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was your idea, Tripp. Initially, it was your idea, and I loved the idea because, to kind of piggyback on what you were just saying, I think a lot of people, when they think of the emerging church movement, they think of Brian McLaren, Phyllis Tickle, Nadia Bolz-Weber. And, I mean, Phyllis Tickle and Nadia Bolz-Weber was the tail end of the emerging church movement. And it all that served to just make me a little sad that, has anybody ever heard of Brad Cecil, Tim Keel, Tim Conder, people like that? Do people know that Doug Padgett worked in Dallas to launch the movement before he moved back to Minneapolis to start Solomon's Porch? I thought that's part of the story that should be told, and I wanted to kind of get it down. So yes, it evolved from your idea of let's do a class in the homebrewed style, which you're exceptional at. But I had this a little more of a vision of more of a produced podcast, like we all listen to, Serial or The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, or, these podcasts that they take a lot more time than just a class or a straight interview type podcast. And that's where we brought in the third member of the triumvirate, Josh, to be the engineer, producer, and the magic man behind taking all this content, some of which we've collected, and I'm sure we'll talk about here in the coming minutes, and a bunch of it we haven't, because part of the reason we're doing this today is to solicit more content from all those people out there who loved Emergent and for whom Emergent was an important part of their lives. So that's kind of how it evolved. Frankly, Josh, you've never really done a project like this before, have you?
No, I haven't. Usually it's just like the linear edit, we're just taking a conversation and cutting it down. But it's funny, Tony, I had just listened to the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling and just pretty moved by, only 8 episodes, but like a ton of interviews, a ton of content, just like finding clips from all over and telling a story that way. And so, originally this was just going to be 8 short episodes, but I think we have like 30 hours of content and more, like it keeps coming in. So, I mean,
Tripp, you don't even know this,
pretty
but
exciting.
Like 2 weeks ago, I went over to Josh's place because we both live in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul area. And I dropped him off a stack of CDs. And it's like,
CDs.
There it is. CDs.
Yeah.
Okay, there's like that's the
compact
audio
discs.
That's the audio of the Emergent Theological Conversation with Miroslav Volf. All 9 episodes of the original Emergent podcast hosted by me. Times when Phyllis Tickle and I spoke at the National Pastors Convention. It's just, I dropped him off like hundreds more
we have to
hours
meet in
of
person,
content.
in person so that we could meet up in this physical media. I'm like, what is this?
I don't even have a CD player to play these things anymore. Yeah. So I passed all this content off to him, and we keep finding content online. It was really, well, we can talk about the history of it, but there wasn't really podcasting. People weren't videotaping conferences so much. If they were, it was on VHS, Mm-hmm. And so some of this archival material is really precious. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think go ahead.
Well, I was just to kind of give some context for where I'm coming from. In my upbringing, so my dad's a pastor, and I grew up in Canada. My dad was a pastor outside Calgary, Alberta, at an evangelical covenant church. And the word emergent growing up, I have a memory when I was 15, was like a swear word in our household. I remember going in to talk to my dad just about like theology when I think I was 15, and he held up this book. I can't remember. I tried to find it earlier. It might have been like a Brian McLaren book or something, but it had the word emergent on the cover. And I remember my dad just saying, Josh, like, keep note of this word. This is like the issue. This is where like the progressives are trying to take evangelicalism. And it was so interesting because Tony hit me up about this, and I recently just saw my dad and told him about this project. And now, having gone, quite a ways away from Christianity altogether, if I were to claim some of these, if I were to hold some of the beliefs that Emergent believed from 30 years ago, they would be so excited. But relative to the time, it was so progressive.
Oh my gosh!
Funny.
I mean, that really that's amazing to me that you have that kind of. I used to say, and this was probably like when you were in youth group, that youth pastors would read a Brian McLaren book wrapped in a Playboy magazine cover because it was like worse to read a Brian McLaren book than it was to flip through a Playboy,
Watch out.
And then Josh, I just want to give a little shout out to Josh too, because then, and I don't know, the trailer, we're going to play the trailer, I'm sure, as part of this episode. Maybe you let off with it. Who knows where you put it, you guys. And when Josh produced the trailer for the Emerged podcast project, I was like, okay, like we're in good hands. It sounds so cool. I love it. And if that's just a taste of the kind of thing we're going to put together for these produced episodes, and we'll talk, there's going to be a lot of other stuff around it too, but I think it's just awesome. Yeah.
So I think the thing to do is maybe we'll just give a big picture of the larger project, and then we'll have some fun giving people little tasters of all that's happened. So the goal for the Emerge podcast is to produce a high quality like professionally done podcasts. And don't worry, Homebrewed listeners, that means that's why Josh is here, because I find editing laborious. Back in 2014, I edited all the podcasts closely for 6 months and saw no big download difference. And I said, oh, well, there goes that. And since then, I've just trusted the Holy Ghost. But we didn't want to do that with this one. And really the goal is so that each episode, it'll be part of telling the larger story of the emerging church movement, from the different streams within evangelicalism and mainline Protestantism and such that flow into it, to the different periods of its kind of early stages, its networking, its growth, the way it utilized different technologies, where different ideas and people became a part of it, where different kinds of church plants and organizational structures develop, and the way it starts to spread and connect with different parts of the church, the way it engaged different big topics that are going along in America and American religion and the changing nature of spirituality. The goal is to be able to edit these oral history and bring in voices from a host of different people that played different roles and tell the story. One, I think Tony and I will be smiling and remembering stories and going, oh, I can't believe we thought that was a reasonable response here, or, oh, I would love to relive that moment. And then for Josh, we'll be like slowly witnessing to him so that his parents call us back up and are like, look, he's like semi-Christian again because he's semi-interested in your early aughts Jesus. And but the goal is to really bring people along that don't know that story of what this one movement that had a lot of attention, negative and positive, sent to it in American religion, but also to hopefully give off to share what it's like, the energy of having a group of friends all of a sudden kind of tap like an energetic root in American life, where like deep desires and questions and frustrations connect with ways of organizing and technology and such that are taking place. And all of a sudden, the normal dividing lines and the normal traditions that you inherit were up for grabs. I remember Tony with hair back in the day talking about it like a volcano, that after a volcano erupts, there's like all the hot lava and stuff, and it hasn't crusted down, and it's alive, and it's dangerous, and there's new land being formed. And I think a lot of people that share right in our current kind of moment of, deconstruction in scare quotes, they share a lot of frustrations and the anxiety and angst and the energy that the emerging church movement had, but it hasn't been organized in the same kind of constructive way. It hasn't been networked in this other in more generative ways that I think was a big part of the emerging church movement. So I hope that the story itself is compelling and maybe inspiring for people to do something with their frustration, angst, and anger, other than just Instagram memes. And so, like, in part of that has been organizing interviews, which have been great. And Josh going through them is funny to hear what sticks out and doesn't stick out, other than like getting the text message going like, "What the hell are y'all talking about?" And I'm like, what do you mean you haven't read Michael Frost before? Everyone has. And these kind of things. And so, like, on top of that, the goal is to crowdfund the production of it so anyone and everyone can hear it. But, our goal, in lieu of like what we normally do at Homebrewed of a class, is to provide all sorts of stuff so that if you do support it or just want to be a part of it, giving anything or a lot of things, there'll be a whole network of resources from like these high quality CDs digitized and making an archive of things if you want to go back and find out that talk that made you uncomfortable, right? When N.T. Wright flirted with universalism and back in the day, and people were like, you're allowed to think that? Mm-hmm. Or like seeing what happened when Tony published the first ebook of most of it in that space, arguing for LGBT inclusion and gay marriage, and seeing the responses. It was nuts, and then since then, half of the denominations have caught up and such. So like there are all these kind of moments in it that we want to have this collection of resources, and some of them are archived things. The other is we want people's stories. Like if you were involved at any point and you are listening to the oral history and you go, you completely can't leave out this story. We want you to tell it to us, and we're going to be weaving them in. So there's not just like these big interviews with kind of the figures you think of, right? Like, Diana Butler Bass or Nadia Boltz-Weber or Brian McLaren, these kind of figures, but also stories from people that participated in all sorts of different places, on stage, off stage, organizing, and that kind of thing. So we want to get people's stories. So part of letting you know in this is, obviously we want you to support it because we want to pay Josh to make it cool. But also, we want to get stories of as many people as possible to weave together. So there's going to be, the podcast will be the archive we're developing, which you can all contribute to. We want your stories and such. And then during the podcast release, when it launches in January, we're going to do weekly live hangs, Tony and I, and then different people that are a part of those episodes and such. Where if you're a part of the supporting community in any way, which could just mean you just sign up, like you don't even have to give to be a part of it. You'll get invited to the live streams. We'll hang out, do Q&A, dig deeper, and hopefully one of the fun things we'll be discussing, like, what should we learn in the present from these past experiences in history. So there's a whole host of ways that being a part of the launch team, being a part of the support and such, it invites you into a larger conversation. But the real reason is we started getting so much content and I hate editing, so we need to do it in a way that makes the story as compelling as the memories Tony and I have. And so many of them that we've been recording. You know what? Maybe one way to give a taste of it, and you can all go to emergedpodcast.com. Tony, is you and I have been recording a bunch of these longer interviews. Is there a story or two or a moment or two that you didn't even anticipate, right? As you went to sit down and do long conversations with kind of friends and leaders and such from the emerging church movement?
One of the things that I've tried to do in the interviews I've conducted so far is drive toward a final question, which is, do you think the movement ultimately was a success or a failure? And I'm not going to spoil it by telling you what each different person said, but I have been surprised, at how the different people I've talked to have answered that question. And I kind of have my answer, but I've tried not to be leading in my asking of it to the different people. And I think that's one thing that everybody who was involved in the movement has had to think about, or has reckoned with in the years since the movement, is they've had to decide. Like for some of us, okay, a lot of people who will listen to this podcast have never even heard of the emergent movement, and to the point of what you said earlier, and Josh, this is maybe a little more like in your generation, but I get all the time from people, oh my gosh, these like millennials and Gen Z kids are deconstructing. We were like, the emergent church deconstructed way, but like we actually know the French philosophical term deconstruction. Like we read Derrida. So there's some of that you might think that this huge de-churching movement, it has a precursor in the emergent church, and I think it does. But there are some real strong differences. So, for instance, one of the things I've been driving at in some of these interviews that you don't see happening in deconstruction is that we were all about planting new churches. We were not. First of all, there wasn't just like the ability to go on the internet and just criticize the church and just write about anger and trauma all the time. That wasn't there were blogs, but there wasn't the proliferation of media where that wasn't an outlet. Maybe that's part of the reason why. Maybe we still had a little more hope for the church. Maybe we weren't as in touch with how traumatizing church life is for so many people. But we started churches. That's what emergence did, which is a big difference from what's going on now. You don't see deconstruction churches starting. You see online communities starting, So that's kind of a long, winding answer to your question, Tripp. But, I sat down in Doug Padgett's basement and we talked for 90 minutes about it. I've talked to my dear friend Brad Cecil in Dallas who was such an important part. And he's one of those names that probably almost nobody remembers. He didn't write any books, but he was he had this very, very famous PowerPoint that he put together that anybody you asked in the church world in the year 1999 would be like, have you seen the postmodern transition PowerPoint from Brad Cecil? Oh my God. Yeah. Somebody showed it to me, or they gave me a floppy disk with this PowerPoint on it, and I flipped through it or whatever. So there's some stuff like that that's super fun to reminisce about, I just want it all. I want it captured. You know what I mean? Yeah. While we're still around and we can remember these things, I just want to get it all on audio so that we can have it.
Yeah. I wanted to jump in too. For me, I'm younger. I'm 28. My deconstruction started 5 years ago. But a major part of that experience for me is the isolation and how lonely it felt to make these choices and to step away from, at the time for me, was like the norm in my circles and at my church and with my parents and all these things. So although it's quite different, like this whole deconstruction movement, in contrast to the emergent movement, there is something that feels very, like it is moving to me, especially hearing all these stories and producing some of this, and even hearing some of like the music and just the ways that people have been speaking about the emergent movement. It almost feels like sort of like a rite of passage, or like the way, like what it must have took people 25 years ago, 20, 30 years ago to make these kind of countercultural ideas, to have the courage. Like for me, I think of Rachel Held Evans saying a lot of things that I felt deep down that I was questioning, but being willing to make a public stance about those things, that just means so much. So it almost feels like that was, in some sense, like the first generation to really ask those questions publicly. And I think the courage that it took to do that, it just feels like an honor to get to hear those stories and to work with some of those voices that just did that way. I mean, nowadays, after, post-Trump, post-COVID, it's like to say you're deconstructing, to doubt these things publicly is like, it's almost cool these days, right? Like it's so common. But at the time, I had a youth pastor who I remember when I was getting confirmed, he had some questions about evolution. He somewhat believed in evolution. This is almost 20 years ago or 15 years ago. And he was later fired for being too progressive. And he was just an honest guy. I think you even know him, Tony. But just the courage it took to ask those questions. And it was so different. Even, for me 5 years ago, it was so vulnerable. But to hear these voices that did it 20, 25 years ago just means a lot.
Yeah, I love you saying that. That's so cool, because there were people would come to our conferences and be like, I'm putting this whole thing on my personal credit card, because if my church knew I was here, I'd get fired. Or, I'm reading your book, but I can't have any of your books in my church office. We'd hear things like that. And you think now it seems people hear that, they're like, come on. I mean, now you go into a pastor's office and you see every Brian McLaren, Phyllis Tickle, Nadia Boltz-Weber book. You see all those books. But at the time, in 2002, that was not the case. And people took really big chances on us, like around 2002 when Mike Yaconelli at Youth Specialties, who owned the National Pastors Convention, was like, let's do an emergent convention right alongside, same building, like same dining hall, 2 different main stages, and people can go back and forth, or whatever. And he took heed for that, for having a conference with us, and that kind of stuff is amazing. And it's been fun, Josh, after I've turned in some of my interviews, and then you'll get a text. You're like, this is money. This is incredible. So Tripp, I want to ask you, one of the things that people heard in the trailer is that there's never before heard audio from Rachel Held Evans, whom Josh just mentioned, and was a huge loss, obviously, for all of us who were in emergent and for all the deconstructors out there. Where's this audio from, and why do you have it, and what's in it? What's the content?
Yeah. It's funny. You know, I made a couple of decisions that, in retrospect, were dumb. One of them was recording 3 episodes of a new podcast I was going to do with Rachel and I. We called it RAT, Rachel and Tripp Talking, in honor of the 80s band. And we recorded 3 episodes, and you know, and she's like, "Oh, my schedule's getting busier. We'll have to do it at this time." And I was on the West Coast, and I'm like, I don't know. So we recorded 3 episodes of it, and then it just kind of was sitting in a Dropbox, and I had completely forgot about it until all the grief in her passing, and you know, went and looked in the Dropbox for Rachel's stuff, and I was like, "Oh yeah, we did do that." And it was kind of actually at a rather wonderful time for thinking about her role in the emerging church movement. When she, was it 2008, 2009, me and Brian McLaren and Philip Clayton were running a series of events called Big Tent Christianity. And in those were kind of important, I think, for telling the story of connecting the emerging church movement to mainline Protestantism in America. Those are some of the, you know, early on when Nadia's first taking off, and the first Big Tent Christianity event was one of Rachel's first speaking gigs, and then you know, by the time we get to the 3rd or 4th one, it's like her and Marcus Borg, you know, and everyone's like, "Oh, this is so amazing," and so the in that moment. And people to hear this in the conversations, it is this whole renegotiation once the kind of more closed part of evangelicalism realizes, oh, there's like other Protestants, and they aren't of the devil. You know, I remember her joking like, you know, until I met Marcus Borg, I thought he breathed fire, and then I find out he's just that's not who he is whatsoever. And so it's at this time where that's taking place, where you have these connections between mainline Protestantism, more contemplative traditions like Richard Rohr and such taking place in the emerging church movement, and where evangelicalism started to close its ranks. The emerging church movement had this big, it was so attractive because it was successful, I think, in making youth groups and college ministries not suck, inspiring lots of young ministers, all these kind of things. But the moment you're like, maybe universalism, maybe critiques of capitalism, care for the planet, and by the way, it's dumb to hate gay people. Like, once those things became center in so many of the local emerging church communities, like that, or come out of the way we did, you know, via meetup.com and all the local cohorts and stuff, you start to get anxiety. I know we did at our cohort in North Carolina from more gatekeepers in evangelicalism. And so those interviews not only are fun in the sense that, you know, we're telling jokes and stories and such, but at that point in time, it's listening to her process all these changes in evangelicalism and getting to know the mainline Protestants at the same time. Someone that, you know, grew up a Baptist preacher's kid and always worked in liberal Protestant churches, going, "Oh yeah, it's cool to come hang out, and we have gifts to bring as well." You know, the story ends with her becoming an a member of the Episcopal Church. It's like, I think it's like, that's one example, but I mean, because of the podcast started in 2008 and there's 1,600 episodes at this point, there are lots of interviews that people no longer have access to that include tons of these figures, you know, from like Phyllis Tickle. We got one where you and Doug are in character. Playing your characters from the Gospel
Summer of
Road
2008,
Show.
Church Basement Roadshow, Roller Gospel Revival.
Yeah. So, and like the episode, I did one with Rob Bell right before Love Wins came out, and he had sent the book, and, you know, I'd heard people were getting worked up, and the interview, I'm kind of like, yeah, this is the Cappadocians. This is literally the people that invented the logic of the Trinity are the ones that said hell has to be empty if Jesus is raised. And he's like, yeah, maybe you should tell Francis Chan. And
that reminds me
there's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that reminds me. I mean, this is so funny because This must have been, let's see, this must have been in like 2003 or 2004. I was at the cohorts were the local gatherings of emergency people. And there was like a map on our website with Google Map pins in it, and you could find a cohort near you. And there was a cohort in Princeton where I was getting my PhD, and it was run by Adam Walker Cleveland, who had one of the biggest blogs out there called Pomo Musings. And he was like a youth ministry guy who then went to seminary. And he coordinated that cohort, and he invited the new president of Princeton Seminary to come to our cohort. And it was Ian Torrance. So as Tripp knows, that's a very famous last name in like Reformed theology.
Yeah, it's Scottish Reformed aristocracy.
Yeah,
right. There's like
his dad.
There's 6 of them.
Yeah, his dad was a big shot guru theologian, and then then there's several kids and he became the president of. So Ian Torrance came. He's this meek, quiet guy with this Scottish accent. You could barely hear him. And we were sitting there and we're drinking beers at this pub and we're debating theology. Can't remember. We had all read a book together or something. We were arguing and this and that. And finally somebody asked, Dr. Torrance, what do you think about this? Do you have any opinions about this? And he just says very, very quietly, I believe this was settled by Athanasius. And that was it. It was like, he didn't want to have a conversation. He was like, there's nothing new under the sun. You guys are just debating Christology like the early church fathers did. And it took the wind out of our sails a little bit. But also I'm like, bro, this is like the enjoyment of theology, is that we get together in these small groups around the country. People are like drinking beer and debating theology and debating Christology. Wouldn't the seminary president be excited about that rather than just try to quash it? And what's interesting, Tripp, is you say, that was in the early days when the mainline church still had not really turned on to emergent. And emergent was really an evangelical thing at that time. And there was a lot in those early days in the mainline people just kind of poo-pooing it. Oh, this is just a bunch of evangelical youth pastors who are starting churches with couches. They don't really understand it, what church is really all about. And then that transition did happen around 2005, 2006, when just like you say, issues of the atonement, biblical inerrancy, sexuality caused evangelicals to basically, and there were some very key moments. There was a book review that Scott McKnight did of a Brian McLaren book, In Christianity Today, in which he basically said emergent is no longer evangelical. And so there were some big moments, which some of these are the things we're going to talk about in the podcast. But back to your earlier point, just to circle back of people contributing. This is the very kind of thing, whether they make the final finished product of the podcast or not, we're still going to have an online archive where if you have a story, you're like, oh my gosh, I was at that conference and I had this conversation in an elevator with Stanley Hauerwas or whatever. And you just want to just record it on your voice memo on your phone and send it to the link in the show note, to the email in the show notes, and we will put it up. And we're just going to build this treasury of memories, some of which Josh will weave into episodes, and some of which will just live, on this website where we're going to have this archive, because people have people have so many great memories of like, oh, I was at this one cohort meeting and this guy became an atheist right before my eyes or something like this, or I tried to plant a church and failed. Or, there's all these things. Like another quick memory is when Solomon's Porch is closing. By the time this episode that we're talking about releases, Solomon's Porch, arguably the preeminent emerging church, cover of the New York Times in like 2000, 2001, is closing down for good. And there's a goodbye sending service. And Josh is going to be there to get some audio for us from that, which is sad and kind of really marks the end of an era. But there was a time when pastors from around the country would take pilgrimages to Minneapolis, and they would come to Solomon's Porch Sunday night, and then Doug and I would have this standing, we'd go to Original Pancake House, and we'd be in the same booth, and any pastor who, if you buy us breakfast, will answer any of your questions about Solomon's Porch, the emerging church, the atonement, whatever. And those are heady days when that kind of stuff was happening. There was so much electricity in the air when stuff like that was happening.
When I talked to my parents about this podcast, they mentioned to me that they met Doug Padgett at Lake Beauty Bible Camp in Minnesota. Tony, have you ever been there? It's like just a Covenant Bible camp. But apparently a game that I've played for decades now, Mafia, was taught to my family and my youth group by Doug Padgett when he was the speaker at Lake Beauty Bible Camp. It was just so funny to see the circles connect there. But I'll be going there this week, and it'll be cool to see. I know it'll be like a heavier... I mean, that church has it has meant so much to so many people. So I'm really curious to see like what that last send-off looks like.
Well, one of the things that I mean, you mentioned, Tony, like in the interviews, asking people whether they thought the emerging church movement succeeded or not, or really what are its fruits and such. I wonder, for those that may be unfamiliar, what were the different questions or frustrations that generated enough energy that a group of people across different denominations and across not even just our country, right? We're going to do a whole episode on what it looked like in the UK and Anglicanism in different parts of the globe and such. But what were the different kind of questions and observations and that centered the energy in those early days?
Yeah, one of the first episodes is going to be about kind of proto-emergent and what was happening in the early to mid 90s that kind of laid the groundwork for emergent. And so I think that's an important piece of it. But I've always thought there were two really main streams of what drove people into what became the emergent movement. The biggest stream for sure was people who thought that evangelical church was broken in the way it was doing business. So it was people who were very disillusioned with what had become regnant in the 80s, which was the big box, seeker-sensitive church. People think of Bill Hybels or Rick Warren, the guys who planted churches that were populated by baby boomers. They didn't have big steeples with crosses on the top. They didn't look like churches. They looked more like shopping malls. And they were meant to grow big. That was the purpose. That was the point of them. And it's seeker sensitive. So what Saddleback Sam and Saddleback Sally, those were the two unchurched people in Rick Warren's imagination that he was trying to preach to every Sunday. And so those were very successful numerically. We can argue about whether they were successful ecclesiologically or theologically or spiritually or whatever. I mean, even at the end of his career, Bill Hybels basically said, it turns out we've been measuring the wrong thing. We were measuring participation, and we should have been measuring change, like life change. Mm-hmm. By the time the GenXers came along in the mid-90s, it was already demographically clear that the GenXers were not following the trend lines of the boomers, and they weren't just like, oh, as soon as they get out of college, have kids, buy a house in the suburbs, they all start going back to church again. They weren't, my generation, Gen-Xers, weren't really going back to church. Definitely not in the same numbers. So a lot of these baby boomer pastors were like, well, what should we do? We need to, this is very evangelical language, we need to raise up a new generation of leaders to do outreach to these Gen-Xers. And there were a lot of Gen X leader pastors coming out of those more conservative traditions like the Covenant, the Southern Baptist Convention, here in Minnesota, the Baptist General Conference. And and the charismatic, a lot of charismatic, like Assemblies of God and people like that were saying, well, we need to do church a lot differently for Gen Xers than we did it for boomers. So that was like the mainstream of people. It's like, we need to do church differently. And then there was a smaller stream that I was a part of, and I had learned postmodern philosophy from Nancy Murphy at Fuller Seminary, which, looking back on, is a shocking thing that a place like Fuller, their philosopher on staff was an Anglo-American postmodern philosopher. Incredible, right? And she did fantastic work and was very influential, not just on me, but on a whole generation of Fuller students. And so I came at it more like the evangelical gospel is broken. And the church is maybe broken because the evangelical gospel is broken. But there's something wrong about the evangelical gospel that we need to try to fix or amend or remedy. So those were the two streams that met. And that, frankly, what led to the most robust conversations in 98, 99, 2000, 2001, when we would get together, because there were these guys coming in who didn't have a ton of theological training. But they were doing church. They were like, they had planted churches and they were trying to figure out how to do it differently. And then there were people like me who are a little more on the academic side, who are like, I'm reading Derrida and Foucault, and I'm not starting a church. I'm just a youth pastor at a suburban church full of white people. So I wasn't doing any praxis that was innovative in the way these church planters were, but I was trying to more do the innovative theological work. So then when we got together, oh my God, the conversations were just like so rich. I'd get on a plane after being at some gathering and just like my synapses of my brain were just firing overtime because of the electricity in the air between these two streams. Now, those two streams also are what led to some down the road of some splitting, like Driscoll or Dan Kimball staying with a very conservative evangelical theology, wanting to do church differently, but really not wanting to reconsider like the theological premises on which their churches were based. But there was a time, kind of a magic time of a couple of years when that's the kind of stuff that was happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the things that it is easy to miss if you weren't a part of it, and a feature that for those that were a part of it animated you, is just how much was on the table for the future of the church. I think most people, when you think of Christianity, or you think of even more dialed into a particular denomination or such, and you go, well, what about our budget, our property, our denomination, our beliefs and stuff are settled, and they're over in that nice box? It was quite a bit is. And then you're like, well, here's how we nuance things, right? So that maybe the Gen Xers get their version of Hawaiian shirt Jesus that the boomers got in Saddleback. And one of the things that consistently showed up in the emerging church movement, people hear it in the interviews and the stories people tell, is that community became something that was centered in a different way. Like for some, that meant like being inclusive in practice and in theology in new ways. And what does it mean? Sometimes it's inclusive of people with doubts. Sometimes it's inclusive of people with identities that weren't there before. If you think of, and I know we're going to talk about this in one of the episodes, there, even in evangelicalism, which I think white evangelicalism in America is showing its true colors more vibrantly now than it did then. In the emerging movement, when the question of inclusion and race came up, it was handled in a different way than it did in evangelical spaces and mainline spaces, and it was intentionally brought up in uncomfortable ways. I know there's a great conversation Tony and Anthony Smith have about this, but that inclusive element plays a role. Another, I think, around community is that for emerging church types, community is something you do intentionally. Yes, there are traditions and practices that come in, but what you do and why you do it and how you do it is something that's your responsibility. That doesn't mean you don't inherit the past, because emerging church communities and the churches that maybe the people were connected to were much more likely to practice Lent and Advent than your average evangelical church. They were more likely to chant something or use old prayers that their Catholic friends used before. Mary will get discussed more. Like, it is intentional, and so it does. So you got that conversation around the ancient future church, but also intentional in how you structure the space, how you structure the sermon, the role of conversation prior to worship. Right? There will be whole groups at churches that get together and argue about the text, and then it shows up in a sermon that could then turn into a conversation in a room. Who's up high? Who's down low? Who gets to serve the elements? All these kinds of things were there, and they weren't just conversations the ministers had. No, the people that were a part of the church said, the God I've encountered in Christ means we need to take with intentionality how we gather, how we act, how we understand our identity. And the whole practice of the community became a place. Your deepest convictions became flesh. And that meant eventually, I think, that the question around community became post-institutional in the way the boomers saw it. And we're hoping it would get fixed. Like, we need to figure out how do we update each tribe getting a few flavors. You could hear it in early conversations with Mainline. So you discovered what Lent is, got a candle and a guitar. Nice. Or evangelicals would get some of the vibe, but then they wouldn't want to reorient the hours their ministers spent connecting to the community that wasn't present to the one that was, right? Like this is true at every church. Most of your money and time gets spent on the people that were there. Well, what if you decide to be, you thought the veracity and the viability of the institution was connected to how it lived with integrity with its neighbors and its enemies? Then those whose job it is to be clergy might actually need to spend more time in the community and might need to be public witnesses in advocating for justice, and might need to make space in their own building if you're going to keep it for people that would never want to don the worship service. Like, all those things were sitting there, and I think that how we embodied our faith as a collective, being the place the theology got worked out, is something that's hard to communicate if in your doubts, in your questions, in your deconstructions, you never went to meetup.com, got together at a local place where these 30 people that would never hang out with each other today because they didn't vote the same, act the same, look the same, and all of a sudden, 6 months later, you're like, okay, well, let's create a mythopoetic structure that embraces the revolutionary power of Jesus and inclusive love, and then also play some sweet early aughts alt music, and then chant something that we got from this Anglican hymnal. Are they kind of Episcopal? We don't know, but it sounds cool, right? Like that role that community was there. The community was the response for so many people in the emerging church movement. It was funded by theology, but the questions, doubts, frustrations got expressed in relationship with people. And that was why I think it was so compelling, and why the people telling stories that people here were so excited to share them, is because today it just doesn't happen as often. New communities are not the response to criticisms. Anyway, sorry. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I mean, I think it's hard for people to even remember 25 years ago. Like, you're talking about Lent. Like, Lent, experiencing Lent, observing Lent, or having an Advent wreath in your church was anathema in a lot of evangelical churches 25 years ago. I mean, it was when we would have like Lily Lewin come to one of our conferences and do a contemplative prayer room, which included like breath and centering prayer, or when we had Johnny Baker come over from the UK and do interactive digital labyrinth at one of our conferences or at the Youth Specialties Convention. That was like super controversial at the time. You think about it now and people are like, I mean, of course, evangelicals do centering prayer and walk labyrinths and do yoga. No, Doug Padgett was on CNN headline news debating John MacArthur about yoga. We were told by people that when you're in down dog, demons fly into your anus because you're leaving it exposed to Satan. I mean, when
an evangelical uses the word anus, thinking that is less offensive.
My book, Soul Shaper, which got turned into The Sacred Way, I have these journal entries in that book, and one of them was about going to a spirituality conference put on by Youth Specialties. Those were called Sabbath retreats, I think. And Mike and Mark Iaconelli would lead those. And they had us do a couple postures. And so I had this line in that book that we did strong mountain pose, a yoga pose. We did a strong mountain pose during this one kind of quiet prayer time. Zondervan made me take that sentence out of the book. I couldn't reference yoga in a book from Zondervan. Couldn't do it. And that just, I mean, where we've moved in the last 25 years culturally in the church is shocking. That's just a little anecdote to say how shocking that was. And that, of course, is part of the legacy of the emergent movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, even
Josh,
at the time,
tell me about your dad. Did you guys have Lent and Advent in your church?
We did. So part
did you open your anus to demons?
I don't remember doing that specifically, but I do remember having Lent, and that felt progressive. I remember my dad was like a co-pastor with two other pastors, and one of the female pastors dreamed that one day there would be a practicing Buddhist feeling welcome at their evangelical service, and that idea itself was very lofty and offensive to him. I remember, I just saw the footage of Doug getting interviewed. I can't remember the news station, but you can tell at the time that, of course, the pastor arguing against him, but also like the news, the host, and just like the way that they frame the idea of yoga, it's just assumed that that's dangerous and risky, and why would you even try that? And Doug's posture is very like, well, I don't know, I want to exercise, and I still like Jesus. It's such a different time than now.
Oh my gosh, I know. Yeah.
My mom's like a yoga instructor now, and it's fully acceptable. There's no doubt that it's
right. That's just been in the last 2 decades, man.
Right. It's wild. It sounds so dated. It sounds like satirical when I was listening to it. I was like, this doesn't feel real, but it was, 20 years ago.
Yeah, it does feel almost satirical, and I think that honestly, I don't even know. I'm sure there are still people who bow at the feet of John MacArthur, but I don't think there are many. I think most of the church, even the evangelical church culture, has moved on from that crazy kind of conservative pietism, like you can't do yoga or you can't play blackjack or whatever. I mean, I just think those are relics of the past, which all back to what you were saying about Rachel. Like that was what I didn't grow up in that, and neither did you, but that's what Rachel Held Evans grew up in. And so for her to become an Episcopalian toward the end of her life was, for us would be like, oh, wow, of course she became an Episcopalian. But for her, what a journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even as we're talking about this, I feel like a lot comes up, and we have memories. And so I just want to emphasize again what you said, Tony, that this is an ongoing, moving, evolving project, that if people do have stories, like we have a lot of the content recorded, but so much of the production is going to happen in the next few months. And I'd love any feedback, emails, messages, whatever, voice notes, because this is very much like capturing as much like the breadth of the whole movement. And so anyone who's involved, like we want that content, and everyone can be part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tony, do you want to share some of the people we've already recorded with and stuff, just to give an idea, and people we've already done and are on the horizon and such?
Yeah, well, a couple of them we've already mentioned. Brian McLaren, of course, wrote many very influential books in the movement, but he started by planting Cedar Ridge Community Church, and he actually came out of like a charismatic Episcopal background. So, yeah, of course, Brian is extremely insightful and funny and winsome, and was deeply, deeply involved in the movement. Doug Padgett, who planted Solomon's Porch here in the Twin Cities, and wrote several books. Tim Condor wrote books and started a church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, co-founded a church. Anthony Smith, who blogged at a blog called Postmodern Negro, which, the first time I remember when we all saw that, we're like, whoa, who is this guy? Like, can you say that? Danielle Schroyer was pastor at Journey in Dallas, and my interview with her was kind of like, what was it like just to pastor week in and week out, pastor an emerging church movement? Emerging church congregation, people have sent, I talked to Rudy Carrasco, who was another name that probably most people don't know. He was very involved in the early days of the movement, and he was like a big crossover influence with us and the Christian Community Development Association, CCDA, because he was doing inner city work in Pasadena, California. Yeah, and then we've had other people send stuff in, like Lily Lewin and Mark Ostreicher from Youth Specialties, and other people like Jason Clark is a UK. I talked to two UK pastors, Jason Clark and Johnny Baker, because there was a lot going on overseas in the UK called Fresh Expressions or called Alt Worship, and they predated us by a few years. So we were stealing stuff from them a lot of the time too.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that people in, or maybe that period of time and what the role theological reflection played is much different, I think, than the current kind of criticisms and such. Part of it is more recent people deconstructing are responding to very specific justice issues, be it 2016 through 2020 and things like, I've ran a survey recently of people that are in, you would say since 2016, they started faith transitions, and all but one of the top 5 answers are social, political, cultural type things. And so there, that's one part of the difference. But I think the other is so much of the emerging church movement. There was a big mixture of people that were actually leaders in evangelical spaces that went to graduate school, that knew a lot more of the tradition and had and things that heads up the Christian tradition's a lot deeper, more diverse than what shows up in popular American religion. And so there's that. And I think part of what kept showing up when leaders felt like we need to make space to change and grow is that we actually have to learn and think it out together. So, Tony, I know that once I connected, I went to all the different kind of theological conversations that Emergent Village hosted. I know online, like places like the Ooze, there were tons of theology message boards and stuff. That's where I first connected with Tom Ord back in the day. Can maybe like contrasting the present and then, like what was the role of like really rethinking the content of the faith rather than like whether or not I can stay and whether or not my tribe performs the right answers that just seem obvious to me ethically?
I mean, I think you already kind of put your finger on it in your preamble to that question. It was primarily theological. Like we didn't just bitch about what was wrong with the church and how much we'd been hurt by the church and how much the church sucks and how much our senior pastor when we were growing up sucks, or whatever. We were talking about fixing the theology and rebuilding the church. This is crazy now when I think back on this. And we never said this out loud, but I know a lot of us thought that we were trying to foment a new Reformation. We were trying to do something no less radical than what Martin Luther did. Now, Martin Luther also wasn't trying to foment a revolution. You know, he was trying to make theological adjustments within the Catholic Church. It's just they kicked him out for doing that. We were trying to make similar theological adjustments. That was what was driving us. And I mean, the deconstructionist Facebook groups or whatever that I'm a part of, that is not what I see happening at all. Even in the ones that I have run, like the Progressive Youth Ministry, it's a lot of like resource sharing, and it's a lot of people justifiably upset, you know, and processing the pain that they carry with them because of the faith in which they were reared. But that just wasn't what we were talking about. Now, maybe our experience of Christianity wasn't as toxic, or maybe because the fact that we were primarily white men meant that we didn't experience, you know, the toxicity of the church and the patriarchy the same way that, you know, women do, that people of color do, that people, GLBT people do. You know, for sure that's a part of it. Because we looked, and the people who were in charge of the church looked a lot like us. So I'm sure we just figured, well, now it's our turn, you know. But like I said before, we were like, oh, let's write books about this, and write books that propose new theological frameworks for people. And let's have conferences, and we're going to be in dialogue with some of the great theologians, you know. And I gotta say, like, Theology Beer Camp, and even the like You Have Permission mini conference that we were at earlier this year, those have like more of a flavor of what we were about, because they're just more collegial, they're more communitarian, they're more constructive, frankly. They're about like, oh, let's talk about this. Where do we go from here? Let's give each other new potential paradigms for understanding our lives together and our lives with God and things like that. So it was a lot more of that. Maybe we were more hopeful. And look, you already mentioned it. I mean, Josh, you did. Like, what's happened in our country politically, the polarization, frankly, the way we've been completely fucked by the internet. Like, the internet is doing most of this to us, right? And it's like killing our civil society before our eyes. And we predated that, so we didn't have to deal with toxic Facebook groups, you know, and moderating that. Hey, look, one of the things I talk to some of my interviewees about is like, do you think it could happen today? And I know, Tripp, you have opinions about that. I do too. It seems very unlikely that there will be another kind of renewal movement. Everyone's in silos now. You know, everyone's in theological silos. And we had such crossover between different theological camps. You know, it wasn't, yeah. So it was so different. It was so different. And I'm actually sure that our podcast will capture some of that, some of the hope and excitement that we had. Even if we didn't accomplish the things that we wanted to, I think it was an incredible time. Like, I know now, when I'm lying on my deathbed, I will look back and be like, those 10 to 15 years were the most fruitful, for sure, relationally fruitful years of my life, without question.
Yeah, and that's clear across the board for so many of the people we've talked to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that technology piece is an important one, especially if you are young enough not to know what it's like when the internet was primarily hooked together by individually coded link directories. When the thing everyone checked on were blogs, Yeah,
in your RSS reader.
Yeah,
your Google reader.
The glory
I love
days.
the Google reader.
I know. This is where Josh starts rolling his eyes. He's like, look at the old guys. Meetup.com, like all you knew was what the group shared values were and what happens when you get there. And you get there, like our local cohort in Winston-Salem was from charismatic Pentecostals to Orthodox priests and everything in between. And, you know, there's not a lot of those ecumenical gatherings. And like in 2008, when we started Homebrewed, there was like us and Nick and Josh podcasts. And we were like the only two podcasts that were in the religion category that liked the planet and gay people. And podcasts are new. And because it was the only thing there, people called in and we left jokes. Like if you went back and listened to the first 2 years of Homebrewed and weren't a part of the emerging church conversation, the volume of inside jokes you have to dodge is significant. And it was okay because like no one else knew how to use the internet yet. It was such a different thing, right? I had an idea when you in your response that I wonder what you think, Tony. Like, you know, part of the difference now versus then is I think people will see when they hear the history of the emerging church. Maybe you talk about Scott McKnight's response to Brian McLaren right after Everything Must Change. This is 2008. Brian McLaren writes a book that's like he had just wrote a book called The Secret Message of Jesus, which, you know, obviously isn't that secret if you read the gospel, but that's never stopped a conservative evangelical. And about like the kingdom of God has something to do with how the world works. And, you know, justice isn't an elective. It's actually at the heart of the gospel, in particular for the underside. So he writes this book, you know, looking at big structural things that would fit in the sin bucket, just like cursing your neighbor, well, I don't know, bearing false witnesses on Instagram and Twitter and such, or slandering, the other things that just seem obviously vile and corrupt. Well, in that, all of a sudden, the emerging church movement starts having splintering out, right, of different groups, because these things that for one part seem obvious, the others are like, oh, no basket, right? And then if you're clear on LGBTQ inclusion, or you're clear on the environmental crisis and the way it's connected to social justice, people just start getting excommunicated. And I think that's kind of like we had a giant stew, the emerging church movement, and all of a sudden evangelicals are like, oh, let's get this out, right? And they start like throwing certain things out, and then they're just letting it simmer, so that what's left in evangelicalism when half of their, you know, entrepreneurial, creative thinking, justice seeking youth ministers get jobs at mainline Protestant churches, I raise my hand, and you're real successful there and you move up and blah, 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 or you just get burnt and kicked out. By the time you're, you know, it's 2016 and 2020, that American religion stew and evangelicalism is just even more concentrated with the ugly and more repulsed by questions and such, that I'm not surprised like the current group has such a much more negative experience when they raise doubt or a question, kind of like Josh talked about, this deep loneliness. I raised questions and doubts, and then like a week later, I'm hanging out with Anthony Smith and Steve Knight at the emerging church cohort, you know, and I was like, oh, this is where we go to hang out. And then I'm like, oh, wow, it's like the third ministers.
Which is a lot different than logging into a Facebook group.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, yeah, I can't overstate how different that is. To be like, oh, here we met at the Acadia Cafe in the Twin Cities. And it was like for lunch, because a lot of these people were pastors, and everybody'd get a beer and a sandwich, and we had our own back room. I mean, we'd have 20 or 30 people show up for this cohort, because it was kind of a hub, you know, in the Twin Cities for emergent D type stuff. Several churches here and stuff like that. And yeah, that's meeting people and like breaking bread with them, to use a cliche, like a biblical cliche, is so different than logging into a Facebook group and like liking someone's post where they're talking about how much they were hurt by the church or whatever. It's night and day. It's night and day. And so, I miss that for sure. I really miss that. And I like, Josh, I'm sorry that your deconstruction has taken place mostly online. I'm glad you get to go to beer camp, and I'm glad that Dan hosted his mini conference. And I really, truly hope there's more stuff like that coming. And Tripp, I just want to respond to you. Like, I'm not going to give away his answer, but one of the criticisms I've heard of the emergent movement is, it just got political. It just got super liberal, politically liberal. So I put that question to Brian McLaren. I mean, that's one of the questions if you tune into the podcast, you're going to hear. I asked him what he says to that criticism. And so, yeah, we're going to get to some of those things, I think, with people. And I think it's going to be really fun and exciting. And I really hope that a lot of people listening right now will, click in the show notes, join, contribute what you can if you want to help support, make this thing happen. And there's some pretty cool gifts. Like, you get, if you contribute, is it $100? You get a coffee mug that says, "I have emerged," with the Emergent leaf logo brown and fallen onto the ground. You probably used to have "I'm a friend of Emergent" leaf on your blog, in the sidebar of your blog.
Oh, yeah.
A widget. You had an Emergent leaf widget.
Oh, I had one. Oh, yeah.
So,
and I will say that, I mean, I think you're right? Like if the questions you have or the frustrations and all these kind of things lead you to a group of friends who have those questions and frustrations and can't shake the vision Jesus invites us into, then very different thing happens, right? And algorithms are not geared towards generative disruption. So it is, and honestly, like when you shared at the beginning, Josh, about that being like the loneliest time, I found I had the opposite experience in finding the emerging church movement. I gave a talk in like 2005 at a statewide gathering for Baptist, and most of the people in the room were really taken back when I said that the heart of the gospel is friendship, and I'd done this talk on it, and then told stories in compelling Southern Baptist minister way that I thought would land the plane, and 3/4 of the room was just like, well, this is a heresy. But after talking to the 7 or 8 people that didn't think I was crazy, they were like, "Oh, so you're one of the emerging church people," and I didn't know what it was, right? So then I Google it, and within a couple years, I had Phyllis Tickle emailed me and said, "I'm speaking at the Episcopal campground, and I need you to do your best 15 minutes, and then come meet everyone." Mm-hmm. Right, and that's like the gateway thing, and then it turned into friendship. Mm-hmm. And one of the elements that I think is hard to describe if you weren't in it is how much friendship was at the heart of it. Yeah. You'll hear those stories of friendship from everyone you talk to, from the ones that think that was the biggest waste of my life outside of the friendship, or, "Oh, it was a creative place and you've seen it expand and go into all these places, and I love that moment for the friendship." And so if I think of, my biggest goal out of this is that people would go ahead and do the risk of figuring out how to have friends again. Friends are peak human. There's a reason the Gospel of John ends with Jesus saying, "I no longer call you servants, but call you friends." And to be friends with the people that will deny you and betray you is to recognize that the other bears a dignity and value that you can't shake off them, and you will be blessed by investing in them. And I think that is something that thread runs right through all the different conversations that are a part of this. Maybe as it goes along, some of the people that told us no from the initial interviews will get lured in. And if you're one of those people, then we have no interest in getting you to agree with our story.
Yeah, or if you're or if you know somebody who is really invested in emergent, and you didn't hear us mention that person's name, shoot them a text right now and say, hey, you should go on that podcast with Tripp and Tony because your voice is super important and you were really valuable to me back in those days. Because there are several people, I mean, look, it's like anything. People have moved on in the last 15 years since it pretty much ended, and I get that. And maybe they don't, some people, because of where it went theologically, they don't really, if they stayed conservative and they're still pastoring a conservative church, they don't really want to be maybe associated with it. They don't want to remind people, hey, I was part of this thing that became pro-gay. But I think hopefully we're trying to tell everybody's stories in very respectful ways. That's what we're aiming for, regardless of where people landed theologically, whether they're in the church or out of the church or whatever. Before we go, I just want to say one more time, Tripp, what you said up at the top is that we would love for people to join us. If Emergent meant something to you back in the day, if you've heard about it, if you read the books back in the day, we're trying to put together a podcast that's more than just an hour-long interview and then the next episode's another hour-long interview. Like, we're trying to put together some kind of project here that's beautiful to listen to. It's got music. It's got various voices. We're trying to get a lot of people involved. It's going to take a lot of time for us, which we look, it's a labor of love, but we'd also love it if you supported it. And it's just like a lot of you probably have paid for Tripp's classes before. It's a very similar thing like to that, except it's a bit different of an output product. But then, of course, not only are there gifts and swag you can get at different levels, which you can all see on the website that's in the show notes, but also, like Tripp already said, you have the opportunity to join us for these live streams after every episode where we're going to talk about it, maybe have some of the guests who were in the podcast on live with us. And if you're one of the contributing partners, you get a chance to ask a question during the live feed and be involved, maybe have some interaction with us and stuff like that. So there's lots of incentives to get involved, but the real incentive should be, I mean, a lot of you like us have a lot of warm fuzzies when you think about Emergent, and this is a way to relive it and then have something, have a relic that we can hang on to. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So head over, emergepodcast.com. Tell your friends. Selectively tell your enemies.
I will say this is funny. Josh is like, I've been looking on YouTube because I want to pull some video and stuff, and there's a lot more anti-emergent videos on YouTube than there are pro-emergent videos.
Definitely.
I'm like, okay, now you're getting a sense of what it was like.
So I